Hi, everyone. We'll give folks just a minute to get their audio connected here. Well, I see folks are still joining us, but as they do, good morning or good afternoon, depending on what time zone you are joining us from. I'm Abra Lyons-Warren. I'm the Director of Cross-Sector Initiatives for the Council of Large Public Housing Authority. Thank you for joining us for day three, our final day of the HousingIs Summit. We're so pleased to have you, and we hope that you were able to join us for the past days as well. Some reflections from yesterday, we heard some great feedback. Folks were actually saying that they wanted even more time to ask questions. We had expanded the time of sessions to 75 minutes for the breakouts, but we will certainly keep this in mind for next year. We're glad that there's certainly been so much interest. Speaking of feedback, we really do value it. So you'll get an email at the end of today filling out evaluations. Please do so. We appreciate you taking the few minutes to give us that feedback so that we can plan for future events for you. We also invite you to join us on Twitter at housing_is and by using the hashtag HousingIs2021. All sessions are being recorded. So if you miss a session or you want to revisit it at a later date or share it with colleagues, we will have that available for you in the next week or two, and we will send out an email with how to access the recordings. Similarly, any PowerPoints and other resources that presenters have provided for sessions can be found in the conference app. Those are attachments under the particular sessions themselves. If you're having any difficulty locating anything, please just drop us a chat or send us an email. Everyone is muted, so please chat any questions that you have to the hosts by using the chat feature. This can be found in the bottom of your screen if you're using a computer, or in the top right if you're joining us via a tablet. We'll be using the chat to receive questions for the official Q&A portion after our plenary panel, but you can feel free to enter questions at any time. There is no need to wait until the end. And I think with that, I'm so pleased. He unfortunately was not able to join us in person, but Senator Michael Bennet from Colorado will be giving us a special video message he created just for all of you and for this conference. So with that, Hannah, take it away.
Hi, everyone. It's Michael Bennet. I represent Colorado in the U.S. Senate, and I'm honored to be with you today. First, I want to thank Sonia Zaderman, the Executive Director of CLPHA, and Abra Lyons-Warren, the Director of Cross-Sector Initiatives, for their work in bringing us all together at the HousingIs Summit. This country has learned a lot of tough lessons over the past year. One of them is the importance of affordable housing. Well before the pandemic, rent was going up much faster than paychecks. 3 in 10 households were spending more than 30% of their income on housing. Many paid even more than that. The situation became a lot worse over the past year as tens of millions of people lost their jobs or saw their wages cut. That's money people can't spend on other necessities like food, medicine, or clothing. It's money they can't save for retirement or for college for their kids. I know I don't have to tell you this, but we can't have economic security in this country until we make affordable housing a priority. I saw that every day when I was the superintendent of the Denver Public Schools. Parents were working 2 or 3 jobs and could barely keep a roof over their heads. And that hurts everyone, perhaps no one more than America's children, which is why I'm so grateful for the work that you do to strengthen partnerships between public housing authorities and schools. Your work is critical to improve educational outcomes and our children's future, because for the last 50 years, we've had an economy that's worked really well for the top 10%, but it hasn't worked almost at all for the bottom 90%. Shamefully, we've got one of the highest rates of child poverty in the industrialized world and some of the lowest economic mobility rates. For the 10 million kids born into poverty in our country, that means they're more likely to stay poor when they grow up. And I can think of no greater betrayal of the American dream. For that reason, I wrote the American Family Act to increase the child tax credit from $2,000 to $3,000 per child, and $3,600 for kids under the age of 6. We also made the credit fully refundable, so the families that needed it most could get the benefit of it with payments on a monthly basis, because diapers, childcare, and rent can't wait until tax time. And I'm so thrilled that we just passed that bill as part of the American Rescue Plan. The enhanced tax credit will cut childhood poverty in this country by nearly 50% this year. At the same time, we also tripled the earned income tax credit for low-paid workers without children, who are disproportionately from communities of color. These changes to the EITC will boost incomes for 17 million workers nationwide. These expanded tax credits will provide people with a little extra breathing room each month to buy groceries, to pay for school supplies, and to make rent. So in addition to the great work you're already doing, I'd ask you this: help us get the word out so families and workers in your communities can access these payments starting in July, and let's fight to make them permanent. Together, we can provide families and individuals the opportunity and stability they deserve. Someday soon, I look forward to thanking you in person for your efforts. Take care and stay safe. Hi, everyone.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Bennet. We're sorry that he was unable to join us live. We're focused today on reducing childhood poverty. And this is something that I think is really integral to the work that we're doing here at the HousingIs initiative. Those of you who joined us at our 2019 summit will remember that we also did a spotlight on this critical issue then. At the time, we were focused on the report from the National Academy of Sciences that was commissioned by Congress. The panel focused on the idea of a child allowance with panelists Representative Barbara Lee and individuals from First Focus, the Child Welfare League of America, and a researcher. We've been really pleased to see the renewed interest in this topic, particularly as it can be tied to housing assistance. So today, I'm especially pleased to introduce our following panelists who will be delving into the research behind the importance of providing supports for individuals and families in order to reduce poverty for children, as well as current policies and potential future policy ideas that can be implemented to help tackle this important issue. So in just a moment, I'll be turning it over to them. You'll be hearing from Dr. Ariel Khalil, Director of the Center for Human Potential and Public Policy, and co-director of the Behavioral Insights and Parenting Lab, both at the University of Chicago. Rochelle Friedman, the Director of Public Policy at the Coalition on Human Needs. Erica Pothig, Special Assistant to the President for Housing and Urban Policy at the White House Domestic Policy Council. And Suki Samra, the Director of Mayors for a Guaranteed Income. I'm very excited about this panel, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from all of our speakers. As a reminder, feel free to put questions at any time in the chat box. With that, I'm very excited to turn it over to Dr. Khalil.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I am really honored and delighted to have been invited to this panel. So I don't have slides, so I'm just going to be talking to you on the Zoom directly. So I was asked to answer two questions in the next 5 or 10 minutes. And those two questions are, from a researcher's perspective, why is poverty bad for children? And what do we know about what happens when we reduce child poverty? So it's a pretty big task to reduce a giant body of academic research to just 5 minutes. I'm going to do my best, but let me just say these are really going to be sort of very high level highlights. I'm reachable if you want to follow up or know where the details of where I got the studies to which I will refer. So, why is poverty bad for children? It's one of the most important questions we could ask. And it turns out that scholars in economics and psychology and sociology, public health have addressed this question, looking at, how is it that poverty shapes family life and children's development. And one of the things I want to say is that when we're thinking about young children, those from, say, birth to age 5, we do really want to understand the links between poverty and family life. Young children are spending time primarily in the company of their parents and their caregivers. And so we want to think about how the experiences of low income and economic hardship are shaping how parents are best able to support their children's flourishing and human development. So I'm going to just suggest again that is going to be a key question that we want to understand. So let me just say again very briefly that the overarching idea and the overarching set of findings from the literature suggests that low income, especially during early childhood, shapes children's opportunity for developing skills and developing the important capabilities that they need for school readiness through several different dimensions. First, maybe it's pretty obvious, but low income impedes parents' ability to purchase the things that kids need to flourish, that children need adequate quality healthcare, housing, nutrition. They need to be able to live in safe neighborhoods, attend high quality childcare centers, early education programs, et cetera. Low income and conditions of poverty sort of obviously impede parents' ability to access those material goods. We can also think of the things that parents need to buy to provide a supportive home environment for children's skill development. Again, nutrition, but things like books and toys and games, or opportunities to take children on outings and so forth for enriching experiences outside the home, lessons, even tutoring, artistic performances, etc. There's just a long history of research that shows that all of these kinds of inputs are critical for children's early development. And as I said, not surprisingly, that low-income families have much less opportunity to purchase these goods and services. Next, we can think about parents' time. And we can think about parental time as a key ingredient of children's successful development. And we can imagine the ways in which living in poverty shapes both the quantity and the quality of time that parents are able to spend with their kids. First of all, as you probably know, the low-income parents are far more likely to be single parents than are high-income parents, and doing everything for child rearing and work as a single parent obviously leaves less time for interacting with children. We also know that low-income parents are more likely to be working unpredictable or non-standard work hours, which may mean that there's a mismatch between when they're at home and when their children are at home, and thus impeding parent-child interaction. So that's the sort of economic perspective where we think about investments of time and money and how the conditions of poverty shape both of those things. I'll turn very briefly now to a complementary perspective, which really comes out of the world of psychology, which again is probably not going to surprise anyone in this audience, but that suggests that conditions of poverty and economic strain undermine parents' mental health, that it increases stress, potentially increases conflict within families. Low-income single mothers, for example, are far more likely to be clinically depressed than their higher income peers. And the ability to manage this stress clearly shapes parents' own emotional well-being and their ability to interact consistently and effectively with their children. Finally, there's a sort of new set of research that really comes out of behavioral science or behavioral economics, which focuses even more deeply on this role of cognitive stress, and the research that is showing how persistent exposure to cognitive stress impedes decision-making and gets in the way of parents making decisions that they want to make, gets in the way of following through on their own goals and their aspirations. And so these conditions of stress that are highly correlated with living in poverty impede parents' ability to follow through on the kind of purposeful parenting that they aspire to do. Okay, and then one more mechanism that we can think about for how conditions of poverty shape children's development in particular says, well, it's not all sort of indirect via what parents do or how parents feel, but that children living in low-income circumstances are directly exposed to toxins and to stressors in their environment that shape their health, well-being, and development. So, for example, exposure to environmental toxins, to housing instability, to violence and trauma in their ecological environments, all can directly shape children's development. And there's a very important body of work that shows how those kinds of stressful exposures can shape the development of children's brains and really shape the architecture of the developing brain, which has lifelong consequences for children's health, skill development, and well-being. So I'll just spend my remaining 30 seconds saying that we have some excellent evidence from the academic literature that when we lift children out of poverty or alleviate the burdens of poverty on their families, children's health, well-being, and skill development improves. Much of the best and most plausible work comes out of economics, which has looked at various policy changes over the years, such as the expansions in the earned income tax credit, the rollout of various programs like SNAP and other tax credits, leveraged experimental data from some of the welfare reforms of the mid-1990s. All of this research together suggests that manipulating or experimentally changing the amount of money and economic resources to which children, especially in the early years of life, have access will have a significant positive effect on both their cognitive skill development, their health, and their emotional well-being. And I know that the speakers on the panel going forward are going to talk a lot more about those policy solutions. So I think I will stop there, Abra.
Great, thank you so much. Next, we're going to turn it over to Rochelle Friedman. Rochelle, I think you are muted still.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to share my screen with some slides. Okay. So I'm going to talk about the child tax credit from as a policy, and it will be a follow-up on many of the things that Senator Bennet spoke about. The American Rescue Plan was a very big deal as it relates to the child tax credit. Changes in the American Rescue Plan, as Senator Bennet said, are projected to cut child poverty in half this year. The majority of the cut is due to changes in the child tax credit. And the impact on racial disparities is dramatic. The plan may cut poverty for Black children by 52%, Hispanic by 45%, Asian America, Pacific Islander children by 37%, and Indigenous children by 62%. Okay, I'm wanting to go to my next slide, and I'm not sure I'm able to do that. I might need some help here. Let's see.
You should be able to just click anywhere on the screen and it'll advance to the next slide.
Okay, good. I'm sorry. Oops, I advanced too many there. Can somebody back me up? I don't know if that's possible.
On the bottom left, there should be 2 arrows.
Okay, good, good. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so the changes in the American Families Act were Rescue Plan rather were huge. And leading up to that, the most recent changes to the child tax credit had occurred in the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act, the TCJA. And these changes were quite significant for moderate and wealthy families. The child tax credit increased from $1,000 to $2,000 per child. The changes, however, were much less significant for low-income families who received the refundable credit. So the child tax credit is meant to lessen one's federal tax liability. However, for low-income families who earn too little to even owe taxes or owe very little, they can receive a check from the government. Thus, the credit is referred to as refundable. So prior to the TCJA, they received no credit until their earnings exceeded $3,000. Under the Act, the threshold was lowered by $500 to $2,500. So I've put up an example of what this would mean for two different families. A couple making $250,000 with two children, ages 3 and 8, receives $4,000 in the credit, while a single parent with two children, ages 3 to 8, making $9 an hour, working full-time, 50 weeks, 2 weeks a year, their income is $18,720. So what they would do prior to the TCJA, they would subtract $3,000 from their income, then multiply that by 15%. So what you see is prior to the American Rescue Plan, these families earned $2,358 in child tax credit. After the American Rescue, after the TCJA, they received $2,433. So moderate and wealthy families benefited by $2,000 if they had two children, $1,000 for each child. Totally, the low-income family benefited by a mere $75. So the American Rescue Plan was a big deal as it relates to the child tax credit because it did a couple things. There is no threshold where the child tax credit begins. So even families with no earnings can receive the credit. In other words, it's fully refundable. So going back to the couple making $250,000, as it relates to the American Rescue Plan, their amount of child tax credit remains the same. But look at the significant increase for a single parent raising two children, ages 3 and 8. The 3-year-old child tax credit is worth $3,600 and the 8-year-old's $3,000. That family earned $6,600 this year in the child tax credit. The child tax credit in the President's recently announced American Families Plan does two things. First of all, it expands the American Rescue Plan provisions for the child tax credit to 2025. Without that expansion, the wonderful $6,600 goes back to what the family formerly received. The American Family Plan also makes permanent the full refundability. And then also just a word about the earned income tax credit in the American Rescue Plan. Low income single working adults who do not raise children in their home formerly received a maximum of about $500 in the EITC, and that credit was available only to individuals between the ages of 25 and 64. But the American Rescue Plan expanded the eligibility beginning at age 19 through age 67, and it tripled the amount of the credit. What is really needed here as it's related to the child tax credit and the stimulus checks is a lot of outreach, because 10 months after the first stimulus check was issued in the CARES Act, 8 million eligible households had not received the check, perhaps because they were unaware and didn't apply. If we go back to the family that I just talked about, earning $18,720 a year, the 3 stimulus checks that have passed for the head of that household would mean they would receive $3,200. If you look at the children combined with the 3 stimulus checks, they would receive $5,000. So in stimulus checks in 1 year, that family would receive $8,200. If you add that to their 1 year child tax credit of $6,600, that's $14,800, which is a lot of money that we don't want families who are eligible to miss out on. The thing of it is, in order to receive the credit, families must file a tax return. A lot of times low-income families who don't owe taxes don't file a return, but they would need to do that. Now we know that the tax filing system, the tax filing season rather, is officially over on May 17th. However, families, individuals who do not owe taxes, they don't have a tax liability, they can continue to file taxes after the May 17 deadline. What's happening is the IRS is setting up a portal so that people can claim their credits. And they're doing so in a way that also enables people to claim part of their credit before the end of the year. You know, usually at tax filing time for 2021, people in early 2022 would file their taxes, they would get their child tax credit. What's happened through the American Rescue Plan is families are going to be able to receive some of their child tax credit beginning in July. And the IRS is quickly scrambling to put together a portal to make that happen. So what we know is those who are on this call, or on this Zoom rather, your role is really, really important. Going back to families who may not have claimed their stimulus checks, may not know about the huge bump up in the child tax credit. A lot of public housing employees like you all on the call have extensive interactions with tenants. Educators and advocates who are on this Zoom call have extensive experience with families who are eligible for these credits. And so I would really encourage you to do what you can to reach out to them through mailers, flyers, text, public service announcements, advertisements in local papers, whatever it takes, because it would be unfortunate if these deserving families did not receive their child tax credit or the stimulus checks. And certainly also be aware that outreach materials should be in many languages to reach the people that need this assistance. So I'm going to stop here for now and thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Rochelle, for all of that information. Next, we're going to hear from Erica Pothig.
Great. Thank you so much, Abra. And so pleased to be here on this panel and discussing this topic. And congratulations. This is, Abra, this is your 8th or 9th HousingIs?
7th.
7th. All right. I've already I've looked into the future and predicted future conferences to come. But it is such an important forum and such an important intersection for the housing community and its partners who foster child development to have. And so thank you for creating the platform for these conversations over 7 years. I know that it has advanced better practice and better policy as a result. So it's really my pleasure to be here. And for those of you who don't know what the Domestic Policy Council in the White House does, our role is really to bring agencies together around these intersectional issues that any particular agency cannot do on its own. And it's to formulate policy and to formulate some of the big legislative packages that I've been asked to highlight before. And I'm thankful to Rochelle, who preceded me to go into the details on the child tax credit. I'll tell you a bit about some of the other features of the Biden administration policy. And thank you, Ariel, for a terrific foundation for why all of this matters and is important already. So let me just add to those particular remarks. So I'm grateful that after 100 days, I can come and I can say that we are seeing very encouraging signs that the country is bouncing back. But we still face significant economic challenges. And as speakers before me have noted, and I'm sure you've discussed in this event, the impacts of the COVID crisis have been disproportionately felt by Black and Brown and low-income communities. Those are communities I know many of you on this call serve, and so you have seen this firsthand. So building back better means making sure that we don't sort of just get bounce back to where we were, but actually improve. And I think the child tax credit is one example of ways in which we hope to do that through our policy and investments. But we know today that 1 in 3 families are still challenged to afford basic expenses, and 1 in 7 renters are still behind in their rent. The American Rescue Plan provides significant relief to American families, state and local governments, and also to our businesses to help get us back on track. For renters, it has provided a lifeline for rental assistance. I think for many folks on this call who I'm guessing are housers, we haven't seen this level of a sort of big investment in rental assistance in our lifetimes. And it is providing an important source of housing stability that the administration hopes to expand into the future. The American Rescue Plan also invested in addressing longer-term solutions to homelessness for families who are without housing, and create more of those kind of long-term solutions through direct investment in homelessness assistance. And as others have noted, for children, it cut poverty by more than half for this year, and we hope to extend that kind of investment into the future through the American Families Plan. Right after the American Rescue Plan passed, and we are in the throes of implementing all of the dimensions of it, the American Jobs Plan was announced. And of course, what followed was the American Families Plan. These are both once in a generation investments in our nation's future. So the American Jobs Plan will create millions of good jobs, rebuild our country's physical infrastructure and workforce, and spark innovation here at home. It includes more than $300 billion of investments in grants and tax credits for housing. And we know, and this conference emphasizes, that housing is a platform for so many of the outcomes that we want to see, especially for children. Just to name a few of the investments that the plan would make, they're calling for a $40 billion investment in the preservation and improvement of public housing. I think the stock, as we well know, is in desperate need of physical investment and improvement. Some of that is to address some of the environmental toxins and concerns that Ariel mentioned that we know has an effect on child development, like lead abatement, for instance, or other kinds of environmental toxin, but also to improve the climate resilience and the energy efficiency of the stock. And we know that that tied together makes for healthier housing as well. Our other investments that would create new housing for extremely and very low income renters. So we know we do not have enough supply of housing in this country. And when we don't have enough supply, it means the cost of housing goes up, and that creates affordability challenges, which when families pay too much for housing, they're not investing in the other aspects of development for their children that Ariel highlighted. So right after we rolled out the American Jobs Plan, and are still working with the Hill on the dimensions of that plan, the American Families Plan, which is a $1.8 trillion investment in our children and in our families, helping families to cover basic expenses that so many struggle with now, lower health insurance premiums, and continue some of the American Rescue Plan's historic reductions in child poverty. So the American Families Plan will extend the key tax cuts. Rochelle mentioned some of those that will benefit lower and middle income workers and families, including the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, and the child and dependent care tax credit. So I'm not going to dive into the details of the child tax credit since Rochelle did such a nice job of covering those features, but I would also add that the American Families Plan also included some critical investments in early childhood education. So one of the dimensions that the plan does is add an additional 4 years of education. And we know we need to do this to improve our own productivity and to improve the lives and frankly, our global competitiveness. So universal pre-K is one of the features of the plan, as well as paid family leave. To help families care, to help parents care for family members, are just to name a few of the other features of the plan, as well as investments in teachers and public education are some other important features of the American Families Plan. So that's the American Families Plan. In addition to the American Rescue Plan, the American Jobs Plan, the American Families Plan, we also had the president's discretionary budget. And in the FY22 discretionary budget, with the full budget yet to be announced, so I'm not going to preview that today, but be on the lookout for the full budget, which will have more details and proposals. The president's FY22 budget also makes a down payment on one of his major goals, one of his major housing goals, that will go a long way to supporting children and families. And that commitment is to expand rental assistance to all eligible households. We know today that only 1 in 4 who are eligible receive assistance, and that we know through research that rental assistance is in many ways a solution to homelessness for families in particular. And so the discretionary budget includes an additional 200,000 vouchers in its request. And we know through research, much of which that Ariel highlighted, that kind of housing stability generates better outcomes for children. And we know that housing is the largest expense for families. And when families spend too much for housing, they aren't investing or it can't invest in nutrition, in child development activities, in healthcare, and other kinds of supports that make a huge difference. So that's what we've been doing for the last 100 days. Thank you very much for allowing me to feature that. Look forward to other questions, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks so much, Erica. And so lastly, before we move into some moderated discussion and questions from all of you, I'm very pleased to have Suki Samra. Suki?
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Abra. I'm Suki, and I serve as the director of the Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration, as well as Mayors for Guaranteed Income. I'll start quickly just with the definition of what a guaranteed income is, and then go into what SEED did and how we built from SEED into Mayors for Guaranteed Income. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the concept, a guaranteed income, oftentimes the term is used interchangeably with the universal basic income. So if you follow the 2016 or the 2020 presidential primaries, Andrew Yang espoused a freedom dividend, which is a version of what of the policy that we're discussing today. So guaranteed income is a recurring cash payment that's given directly to individuals. It's unconditional, no strings attached, and no work requirements. But the idea really being that if you can boost someone's income, hopefully you see a number of other changes, and just providing income stability in a way that we know that a lot of low-income Americans currently do not have. The idea has a long civil rights history, particularly being espoused by Dr. King in the 1960s, as well as the Black Panther Party and the National Welfare Rights Organization. So SEED, the Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration, was the nation's first mayor-led guaranteed income demonstration, We launched in 2017 with disbursements starting in February of 2019, and we gave folks $500 per month to 125 randomly selected Stockton residents for 24 months. We were an RCT, a randomized control trial, and we really wanted to understand how does a guaranteed income disrupt income volatility, and how do changes in income volatility impact emotional as well as physical well-being for our recipients. And the demonstration has concluded, and in March of this year, we released our first year preliminary data. And so in terms of what we saw in the findings, actually goes back to a lot of what Dr. Cleo was saying at the very beginning, looking at the ways in which income insecurity and income volatility and really removing the drumbeat of financial insecurity can improve outcomes for folks who are experiencing economic insecurity. In terms of our first research question, how does a guaranteed income impact income volatility? We saw that income volatility reduced for those who are receiving the $500 per month versus a control group of those who were not. It was still at about 46.4%, whereas for the control group, it was at 67.5%. And less volatility is important because stabilizations in monthly income allow families to really plan for the future and gives them the mental space and the capacity to really anticipate any future hurdles that might come up. In terms of the second research question, how does income volatility impact psychological health and physical well-being? We saw that recipients were less anxious and depressed, both over time and compared to the control group. And we also saw that recipients reported improved emotional health and well-being, and improved energy over fatigue, both over time and compared to the control group, and that those who are receiving the $500 per month reported decreased physical pain. And just one example of the ways in which we sort of operationalize physical and emotional health. It's if you've ever gone to the doctor's office, you've probably received something called the SF-36 and the Kessler-10. And so what we saw on those two scales was that at the beginning, in February 2019, both people in the treatment group and the control group, so those receiving the $500 and those not, would score as sort of mentally unwell or having some form of a mild mental health disorder. What we saw a year in is that while the control group continued to sort of qualify as having a mild mental health order, the treatment group was more likely to be well. So again, these are clinically and statistically significant improvements in health and well-being for people who receive the guaranteed income. And again, this is important because decreases in anxiety and depression increase capacity, again, for goal setting and for coping with unexpected shocks. We know that poverty gets under the skin. We know that folks who are experiencing economic insecurity are more likely to develop anxiety and depression. And we saw in just a year that giving $500 per month can reduce those outcomes. Our last question was, how does a guaranteed income generate agency over one's future? And we measured that through sort of three things: changes in employment, changes in risk-taking and goal setting, as well as this concept of freedom from forced vulnerability. So the number one question we received when we launched Seed was and the criticism was that if you give people money, they're going to stop working. Really rooted in this myth that I think many of us don't believe, that if you give people money, or that folks are lazy because they're lazy, or folks are poor because they're lazy, folks are poor because of some sort of moral deficiency. And we saw that that just wasn't the case. We actually saw that people who were receiving the $500 per month were more likely to be employed full-time a year into the program than they were at the very beginning. So this was at the very beginning of the demonstration, 28% of people who were in our treatment group were employed full-time, whereas there was 40% of folks who were employed full-time a year in. This is compared to only a 5% increase in the control group over the same time. So why? Again, the $500 per month removed material barriers to full-time employment and created capacity for goal setting and risk-taking. So again, once you remove the drumbeat of financial insecurity, you see that people are finally able to sort of take a step back, have the breathing space needed to envision a better future for themselves and their families. So that sort of wraps up the results that we saw from the first year of Seed. Anecdotally, while we won't be releasing these outcomes until March 2022, a year in, because our research is still ongoing, we did hear from a lot of our recipients, again, to what Dr. Cleo was saying at the beginning, the capacity to be better parents and to be better spouses, and the ability to finally have dinner with their children, to finally understand what their kids are doing in school, to sign their kids up for tutoring and in sports. And so really, we saw the ways in which a small influx of cash allowed people to show up as the people that they wanted to be in a way that financial insecurity didn't let them be. From Seed, and sort of based on the results that we saw, and just the number of inquiries we were receiving from folks who also wanted to launch guaranteed income pilots, we launched a group called Mayors for Guaranteed Income. We are a coalition of what started as 11 and now almost 50 mayors across the country who are advocating for federal guaranteed income. About half of the folks in our coalition, which is as wide-ranging and far-ranging as LA, Los Angeles, California, to Tacoma, Washington, to Gainesville, Florida, to Cambridge, Massachusetts. About half of those cities will be doing pilots, and our coalition's goal, again, is ultimately for federal guaranteed income. We are super excited about the child tax credit, and we see that as basically and effectively a guaranteed income for parents. But I'll stop there.
Great. Well, thank you so much. As the panelists have sort of built on each other and said, I'll just echo that. I think, we've gotten a really fantastic overview, both from the research side and the foundation behind this work, as well as some current policies and some new ideas in research and practice that we're seeing being tried out. So again, if you do have questions, please put them in the chat box at the bottom right. But I wanted to start by asking the panelists, some of you touched on various factors, but I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about what other factors in communities in particular might make something like a universal child allowance more effective. So is it purely just the act of giving parents a cash allowance, or are there other factors in communities that may make a difference as well?
I'm not sure about factors in communities, but I'm thinking back to Erica was talking about many of the wonderful policies that are being proposed in the American Families Act. So access to education, access to childcare, a lot of those pieces. I think Ariel also mentioned many of the factors that families need to survive and thrive. So I think they all go together. When I think of a family, I think of, basic needs for food, for housing, for education. They all combine together. And I think too, the tremendous racial and economic disparities in our system. Recently, I was talking. I'm from the Midwest. I'm from Dubuque, Iowa. And recently I heard a talk which talked about Dubuque has 65,000 people. Redlining is rampant in Dubuque, Iowa. And so I think there are all sorts of policies and efforts that go together that create a welcoming environment, a wonderful environment for low-income families and vulnerable people to survive and thrive.
I would just maybe add to that to say, I think one of the other aspects of, and to Rochelle's point, having services in communities that people can invest in, right? And we also know through research that sometimes there's a real cost differential in those services for low-income people than for people who have more ability to who live in communities where maybe the cost is more reasonable. And so that's one aspect. So I would say, just like payday lending is a good example of this, right? We know that there is a high correlation between where payday lending outlets are and low-income communities, and that the debt that creates for families puts them out of reach of ever sort of repaying that kind of debt. And that kind of delinquent debt then creates other kinds of reciprocal conditions. So I would say on the list of things in community, I would put sort of affordable credit options. I would put options for families to save and grow that kind of investment over time, and have access to that kind of reasonable support and advice that other families have also for thinking for the long term and how to translate the resources, not just into investments for today, but investments for the future. But we know that those kinds of services and supports and vehicles for savings don't always find themselves in the same communities where low-income people live.
Mm-hmm. I guess I would also just quickly add the desperate need to increase the minimum wage. And many times, even in some more conservative states, there are cities that have tried to increase the minimum wage, but have been overridden by their state legislatures. So we need to increase the federal minimum wage. We need work to pay so that low-income families don't have to have 2 or 3 jobs. As Ariel said, that gives them less time with their children and to develop relationships and to thrive as a family.
Great, absolutely. And so I think, one thing that's kind of interesting, I mentioned on a different day of the summit that when I'm feeling an optimistic spin, so a lot of these changes have come about because of the pandemic, which of course has otherwise been not really a great situation. So I'd love to hear you all speak a little bit more about the lasting impacts, though, you think that COVID-19 has had, particularly on low-income families, and thinking about that through the lens of providing supports for these families.
Well, I could start out, Abra. I mean, I think a pretty important question is the extent to which kids have fallen behind in school, and the huge number of kids without sufficient broadband access. I mean, to me, that just seems, tragic that so many kids did not have the bandwidth, literally, or also metaphorically, to come to school this year. And I think we don't know the extent of how far kids may be behind academically. And I also think it's really important to lift up that many kids thrived and many kids developed other skills, and parents did heroic jobs. But I see a lot of interesting proposals on the table. For example, high impact or high intensity tutoring, a core of a tutoring core that is going to be able to get out there and help kids catch up for those who have fallen behind.
And could I just follow on it? So I lift up the aspect of the American Rescue Plan that over $100 billion of investment in helping schools, not just, and I think some of the features of that have talked about, like, we need to change our facilities to make it, but a big piece of how school districts are spending those resources are in recovery services that Ariel just mentioned over the summertime, enabling kids to get additional supports and to bring them back up to grade level or to give a boost. And so that was another dimension and aspect of the American Rescue Plan. And without a doubt, the president is very concerned about the social emotional well-being of children, which is why the emphasis has been to help kids get back to school and safely, and for teachers to be able to teach safely too. That's a critical part of the investment.
One other thing that's happened during the pandemic is more women than men have left the workforce, and they've left it probably for many reasons. Perhaps it's because their children were no longer in school and maybe the child care center closed or whatever. So I think that's going to be a major big thing, because sometimes I think statistics show that once a person is out of the workforce for 6 months or a year, it's often very difficult to get back into it. So that will be, I think, another lasting impact. While some families did well when the parents were able to work remotely from home, again, a low-income family was less likely to be able to work from home because they were essential workers. They had jobs that related to areas where they needed to leave home to be of service. They were essential workers basically, and they couldn't work from home.
Great, thank you. And I think it would be helpful also, I'm not sure entirely what everyone is allowed to say, but would love to hear more thoughts about, really the actuality of having some of these policy ideas implemented. So, you know, both from a political landscape, but also, Suki, I'd love to hear a little bit more about some of the challenges or successes that the mayors who are part of your group are facing.
Sure, I can start. In terms of challenges, and I'll start with sort of challenges in the ways in which we're aiming to overcome them through the coalition. I think one, until very recently, guaranteed income was very much thought of as like this far left, crazy sort of like either this far left, crazy socialist idea or something that was only sort of talked about in tech circles. I think the demonstration in Stockton, as well as the pandemic, just really shined a spotlight on the fact that too many families are struggling, particularly Black and Brown families. And it was Black and Brown families that were sort of most impacted by the pandemic and were already most impacted by economic insecurity. And so we've seen support for recurring cash payments increase in part because of the CARES Act and the other stimulus checks that have gone out since then. And our hope really, again, is that this becomes a federal guaranteed income in terms of sort of pathways to legislation. Then Senator Harris, now Vice President Harris, actually had proposed legislation in the Senate called the LIFT Act, which would have essentially provided a guaranteed income to working families of about $500 per month, $6,000 per year. And that was paid for by a reversal of the Trump tax cuts. And so really, when we're talking about budgets as moral documents and putting our money where our mouth is, if we really care about equality, making sure that we can do this through a simple reversal of the Trump tax cuts. Other sort of legislation, there was a host of bills around pandemic guaranteed income introduced by folks. And then in sort of more progressive circles, you see a guaranteed income paid for either through a wealth tax or through a data tax or through cannabis legalization and cannabis revenue. So there's a host of different sort of policies and how to pay and ideas for how to pay for a guaranteed income that currently exist. Our hope is that through Mayors for Guaranteed Income, the number of pilots that we're running, we're able to build the evidence base that is needed to actually implement this at scale.
I'm gonna assume Erica is maybe not allowed to say more here then. Okay, great. So I think as a follow-up, Suki, do you think that the pandemic specifically has affected support for a guaranteed income, especially as we've seen the value of generous unemployment benefits combined with the stimulus checks?
Yeah, and we actually, MGI in partnership with the Economic Security Project actually conducted some polling. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I can be sure to send those if folks are interested. But we did see that support for guaranteed income, support for recurring checks has increased over the past year especially. And this is especially true in communities of color, Black and Brown communities, that support for recurring checks at least until sort of the economy has recovered. And I think when we're talking about the economy recovering, we at MGI are really interested in rooting ourselves around specific metrics around like Black unemployment, not necessarily talking about the economy at large and continuing to propagate the issues that existed in the first place. But we have seen that public opinion has increased and there's just more familiarity with the issue. I think because, again, of the stimulus checks that have gone out. So folks see that the federal government can get checks out pretty quickly and that the checks can have an immediate impact. We say that cash is the currency of urgency. And we've definitely seen that during the pandemic where folks are able to, with cash, use it to meet their most urgent needs. It's unlike other social safety net programs in that for one family, it could be tires, and another family, it could be food. And so really, in the pandemic, I think we've seen that cash allows families to meet their needs very quickly, very efficiently, and very flexibly.
Abra, I also want to just follow up on what Suki said. So we also actually at the Harris School just collaborated with the AP and the National Opinion Research Center to do some national polling on Americans' attitudes towards, what children needed to flourish. And we did ask a set of questions about these various policy levers. And there was certainly a high degree of support for for expansions of these tax credits. And I think, as Suki said, there's just a lot more awareness now. So, providing families with direct economic assistance was widely valued. But the thing that this representative sample of Americans said was the most important thing to do was to provide parents with more time to spend with their children and their families. So I just want to, echo Erica's, description of, the paid parental leave dimensions of the new initiatives, and also just connect these two ideas in that, you know, cash assistance to families is hopefully going to allow parents to spend more time or different types or quality of time with their kids along the lines that I remarked on at the beginning of our session today.
Yeah, thank you. That actually leads right into another question that we received, which was about other kinds of in-kind supports. So obviously there's been a lot of focus both in our panel today, but also in the country about income supports, but other things like expanded or in some cases, you know, including at all paid parental leave, but maybe things like home visiting programs, you know, should we be focusing? There is a lot of compelling research that you all have just taken us through about cash supports, but talk a little bit more about some of the other supports and if you think that that might be an approach that we should also be looking at.
Did Rochelle want to comment? Or Erica, you go ahead and then
No, go ahead, Ariel, because I think this is you know the research well on this topic. Yeah.
Well, I do study parenting, and so I do have a special place in my heart for thinking about. So Abra, you mentioned nurse home visiting. That's certainly one very important pathway to supporting very disadvantaged, socially isolated young mothers, and it has been found to have some important effects on key outcomes. I think it's really important at the federal level to do a variety of things that signal that families are important and that parents are important and that we as a country really value what parents do. So what I would love to see is a broader set of initiatives on the menu, some of which are pretty low cost and light touch and highly scalable. So Nurse Family Partnership, as I said, is a highly valued program, but it's a very expensive and very intensive kind of program. I think there's a lot more we could put in the toolbox that would signal how we support and value parents, whether that's just sort of light touch ways of supporting parents to read with their kids every day through leveraging technology to reach parents, whether that's the kind of thing where in other countries all new families get a baby box with some diapers and a book and just some very basic stuff. Again, I mean, that alone is not going to move the needle on kids' cognitive skill development, but I think it's a very important signal. And I think it would, and sort of signaling what we value is hugely important. And I would, that's what I would love to see a lot of in this new great, amazing period of policy initiatives that are supporting families in so many important ways.
Let me just say, I really appreciate that, Ariel. And I have been thinking with the new data on the decreasing fertility rate too, right? When we think about what we need for our future, we need families and parents to feel stable enough to have children. And that contributes to our vitality as a nation. And when they don't feel secure or stable enough or feel like they have the resources to be able to have families and support those families, clearly we're not going to be able to support the growth of our country in that way. So I think the American Families Plan is clearly a signal in that direction, but would of course love to hear more of your ideas on some of these other kinds of complementary efforts to send that strong signal.
Great. So switching gears just slightly, we got a question. This I think would either be for both of you, for Rochelle and Erica. Can you speak a little bit more about the effectiveness of HUD Section 3 program regarding providing economic opportunities?
Does Rochelle want to take that?
I'm going to pass that to you because I'm not real familiar with it.
So I appreciate the question on Section 3 for those on the panels or for those who don't know. Section 3 is a requirement or that any kinds of sort of investments, especially help to redound to the benefit of the local community through hiring and other kinds of contributions. And so I think Section 3 is in many ways aligned to some of the other goals that the administration holds in terms of really taking a very close look at how our own contracting procedures are benefiting and helping to grow more wealth and opportunity and income, especially for communities of color, and other kinds of efforts to support hiring. The president in particular is very focused, and the dimensions of the jobs plan include commitments to ensuring that the investments result in living wage opportunities. And so I think about Section 3 in that context and how it can contribute to some of those broader goals.
Great, thank you. And I think sort of thinking about that explicit connection with housing, we've been talking broadly today about low-income individuals and families, which of course public housing residents are. But are there ideas or research that specifically focuses on that population of folks in subsidized households that might allow for specifically targeted interventions for that population? And I guess I'll add while you all are thinking, we of course have many housing authority staff on the line. So thoughts as well about ways that housing authorities can help their residents with many of these ideas.
So I think about, so go ahead, Ariel. On research questions, you should always go first.
I mean, just to reflect on some work we're doing right now, which is in collaboration with the Housing Authority of Cook County. We are working to, to share a very light touch parenting intervention with that population. But one thing we can observe is that a very small share of those households who have preschool age children has actually got the child enrolled in a pre-K program. So I'm like sure this is well known to every single one of the people who's listening in, who's working in this area. But connecting these populations to the services that hopefully are going to be even more widely available in the very near future, I think is top priority.
I would just add to that certainly, I mean, some of our strongest evidence is, and I used to lead the Office of Policy Development and Research at HUD, so I'm very familiar with the research agenda that that HUD has been investing in over many years with investments from Congress. One of the more historic investments has been the Jobs Plus investment, where we know and understand the relationship between the structure of rent and the interest of folks, or the ability that folks have in taking other job opportunities. I think the part of our conversation today has been about what are the incentive structures even that motivate the decisions that low-income people have. So we know that there's a huge cliff effect in housing, right? It is the largest income transfer. If you have rental assistance or you have housing assistance, it is among the largest, if not the largest, income transfer for families. So anything that jeopardizes that is going to jeopardize a large share, 30% of the family's income. And so we know that the structure of rent has the capacity to either incentivize or perhaps disincentivize certain kinds of decision making that families have regarding work, the risk that people are willing to take on in relationship to if they're offered a very modest increase in income, but somehow that increase in income might jeopardize their housing assistance, that is going to potentially affect their mobility. So I do think the space and opportunity that we certainly need to dive into more deeply and understand in the future is how to ensure the structure of our housing policy, especially as it relates to how households pay for rent, relates to the decisions they make about the kind of jobs or career ladders they pursue, and that we're rowing in the right direction in both of those spaces. And so I would name that as an important aspect of policy that I think we have more to do to understand and explore. And I do think in that context, I mean, one of the policies that is being evaluated and has had some mixed results in the past, but I still have hope for the future, is the family self-sufficiency program that, again, takes that sort of aspect of the increment of rent that you earn, that you might create through increased earnings, but allows you to put that toward investments that will create more opportunity for your children or your own mobility. I think we need to continue to look at those intersections.
Great, thank you. So earlier you all were talking about, Rochelle in particular mentioned that women during the pandemic have disproportionately left the workforce and also disproportionately taken on a burden of childcare and virtual schooling. So we have a question around first noting that childcare is not just a woman's issue, it's an economic issue. But also asking, there's been a lot of discussion recently about the childcare crisis being exacerbated by the pandemic. And as we think about ways to support women, especially returning to the workforce, what are the best investments we could make to make sure that families, especially low-income families, have adequate childcare options? And I would also add, of course, quality childcare and accessible into that as well.
I think Erica mentioned that another aspect of the plans the president has put forward is to make the child and dependent care credit refundable and to significantly increase that credit, because that is such a significant factor in terms of whether or not people will be able to go to work. And then also in the American Jobs Plan, that there's money. A lot of child care facilities have shut down during the pandemic, and so money to restart them. And again, I go back, I mean, it just is kind of mind-boggling to me how resistant our country is to have a living wage, and we have a minimum wage that's inadequate. So we have the facility needs, but we also have the personnel needs, and childcare workers, people who take care of elderly, home care workers are not adequately paid for the work that they do. So I really think we need to look in our country at our pay structure. And so that's one piece.
Oh, I might just add briefly, taking particular care as we expand universal pre-K for, say, the 4-year-olds, that we make sure we have enough paying customers or subsidies to support the 3 and 2 and 1-year-olds who are left in very expensive infant care, that those 4-year-olds are no longer subsidizing, with their, it is a sort of, this is the unintended consequence of having all the 4-year-olds move over to, the public school system. They're no longer, participating in the childcare or sort of, community-based care structures that they were formerly participating in, leaving the very young and more expensive kids. So it's just, it's the multiplicity of problems. The care is more expensive and they've been, really hurt by the pandemic. So I just think really focusing on what's happening as all these various policy initiatives are working together. I'm sure Erica is well aware of this.
I mean, you're raising an interesting dynamic, Ariel. Have there been studies of the cities that have more of the universality and how that impacts the cost structure for daycare?
So I just have paid, a little bit of attention to what's going on in Chicago, of course, and I'm not 100% sure how systematic it is, but I think there has been some interesting dynamics between, Chicago's expansion of its universal pre-K program and what's happening in the community-based care centers where the 4-year-olds, were formerly attending. Like whether the extent to which those things are causally related, I would not be in a position to say right now, but I would say, there's just been some discussion about the role of that in some of the closures of these community-based centers.
Yeah.
I think it's worth understanding more systematic than I can help at this very moment.
It's a really important question. And I would just add to Abra, because your question was about certainly in the pandemic, that just to note that the American Rescue Plan included $39 billion of investment for childcare, recognizing that childcare centers were impacted by the current crisis and that we need them. We need them desperately to enable people to return to work, but that was, so there's a child care investment in the American Rescue Plan. There's a child care investment in the American Jobs package as well as the $400 billion investment in the home and community-based services, which is largely for older adults. But so one thing I would just also highlight, though, in terms of thinking about families holistically, is we also know that so many particularly women in families are also caring for older members of those families, and that has an impact also on their ability to being in the sandwich generation, I can say this explicitly, people are trading off caring for parents or other older family members and their children. And so one of the other aspects of the American Jobs Plan also makes a significant investment in home and community-based services, which is one of the ways in which care workers help to support both older adults, but also people with disabilities as well. And both to think about the kinds of wages that they're paid, but also to make sure that safety net exists, recognizing that certainly family members are doing this, but when they're doing that, they may not be able to do other kinds of supports at home as well.
Yeah, so I think you both bring up some really good points. So in DC, they actually have universal pre-K for both 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. But one of the challenges, I don't know about sort of what you were posing, Ariel. I think that's a really interesting one about the unintended consequences. But one of the challenges that has existed in what is, a relatively new program for the district, and this existed before the pandemic. So I would love to hear thoughts about sort of this problem that has certainly been exacerbated, but is not a new one, is again, just around the access. And, DC, and I think a lot of other cities operate similarly. It's a lottery system. So it's A, not a guaranteed spot, but B, not necessarily an equitable system for all. So just thinking through ways to provide solutions for that, not in a pandemic world as well. Well, I guess we have a panel topic for a future summit then. I know that this is definitely something that a lot of the housing authorities across the country are working quite deeply in. As you all have highlighted, it's a pressing issue for families in assisted households, particularly those who work jobs with unpredictable schedules. So certainly one for us to continue looking into. I think we're nearing the end of our time, so I would love if everyone, if all of our panelists would take some final moments to make concluding remarks about if, what you would hope might be the most important thing to focus on in the coming months and years, or if you want to leave our attendees with one sort of most important thought, that would be great.
Well, I guess I can start from a policy perspective. I think it's very, very important for everyone attending to do strong advocacy, because there will be pushback. The American Families Plan and the American Jobs Plan are absolutely once in our lifetime efforts to do some really and very much needed things for our infrastructure, for our physical infrastructure, but for our human infrastructure. And there will be, and there already is, a lot of pushback. We know one entire side of the aisle, the head of the minority leader of the Senate said, nobody in my caucus is going to vote for this. And that's very, very problematic. Everybody in his caucus voted for the 2017 tax bill, which overwhelmingly favored corporations and rich people. So come on, we need some strong advocacy, because this stuff is really, really important. And it's really important to the people who are in the public housing units, people who are so desperate in terms of the needs that they have.
Well, I'll just say, as you know, from a researcher who's been working in this area for over 25 years, I can just say this is incredibly exciting to see, the work of so many people, including, many researchers who've been producing the evidence that, have laid the groundwork, and that, a lot of that evidence was clear in Biden's address. It was great to be able to link a research paper to something the president said, and to know that this is really for the first time in ever in my research lifetime, seeing these amazing things all together on one platform.
I would just echo both Ariel and Rochelle's comments. This is a really important time to engage, and an important inflection point. And we don't get these times often in a generation. And this is, I feel like, is our moment, obviously, and we could use everybody's help in moving these agendas forward. So and housing is a platform. And I know many in this call spend their daily lives really ensuring that it is the kind of platform that is enabling of children to grow into their potential, and that we remain committed to, in the Biden administration, to figuring out how to support that intersection and ensure it continues to be an even stronger platform going into the future. And we can really use your help and rely upon your expertise every day.
Yeah, I would echo what folks have said, and I think just add that one of the most compelling things about CASH is that we can use it to target, again, racial and gender inequities, and really use it as a way to make sure that Black and Brown folks aren't disproportionately impacted the next time there's a pandemic. So I think as we're all doing the work of making sure that our communities are building back, that we're doing so with a specific emphasis on communities of color that were disproportionately impacted.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again so much to our esteemed panelists. It was really a pleasure having you all here to share your expertise with everyone. Appreciate you taking the time. I know you all have very busy schedules, and that Suki is joining us from the West Coast, so appreciate that as well. So I think in just a moment, Hannah will be bringing up a slide here, but want to remind folks that we are going to be taking a brief break before reconvening for our afternoon sessions. So we do have 3 tracks, just as with the past days: housing and education, housing and health, and housing and partnerships. So today we will be looking at, as I mentioned in the chat earlier, maternal health and infant vitality in our health session. We will be looking at digital equity issues, focused more on policy for those of you who may have joined the session earlier in the conference. Today's is focused on policy. And then we also have a session on measuring racial equity, which I'm sure will be a really interesting conversation. So Hannah, are you able to bring up that slide? Great, thank you so much. Here you can see the Zoom links. They are the same that we've been using every day so far. There is no change, so hopefully this looks familiar to you, but please do let us know via email or chat if you are having any technical issues. But we will be reconvening at 2:45 p.m. Eastern time, so that is in about 15 minutes. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in the breakout sessions.